Hello, thank you for joining us for the last chapter of our trilogy. My name is Phoebe James and I'm a Professional Development Officer with the Hunter New England Central Coast Primary Health Network, and I'll be facilitating this session. To start the proceedings this evening, allow me to introduce John Bailey, who is the Executive Manager of Primary Care Improvement at the Hunter New England Central Coast Primary Health Network. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Phoebe, and welcome everyone. Welcome to the third in our trilogy, fire, bushfire protection and thunderstorms when they affect your practice. I'd like to introduce Leanne Bell, who's an officer with the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, and Dr. John Goswell, who's a GP and advisor to the PHN on disaster response. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet tonight and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We hope you enjoyed this series and hope you enjoyed this final presentation in the series. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome everyone. My name is Ellen Sinft. I'm the PHN Manager for Disaster and Emergency Coordination. Great to see so many people again tonight. I will pass on to the first presenter for the evening, Leanne Bell. Thank you, Leanne, for joining us.
Hi everybody, just jumping across to the presentation for you. Here we go. My name's, as you know, Leanne Bell. I work for the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. I'm a Fire Behaviour and Planning Officer and I'm based in the Hunter Area Command. So our area looks after north of the Hawkesbury all the way up to Nambucca and out to the west of the Barringtons, Dungog and Singleton and Muswellbrook local government areas as well. I have worked for the service for 10 years and I've been a volunteer firefighter for over 20 years. I have spent a lot of time working with businesses and the communities, getting them to understand their risk of bushfire and helping them better prepare and to mitigate those risks. So just a little bit about the Rural Fire Service. We're the lead combat agency for bushfires in New South Wales, but we also deal with structure fires, motor vehicle accidents. We assist other agencies such as the SCS with flooding and storm response. We have over 72,000 volunteers, 1,993 brigades, over 1,100 staff and over 4,000 appliances. Not just trucks, but we also have planes and boats and all sorts of weird and wonderful equipment that we use in our responding to bushfires and other emergencies. So what I hope to achieve for you today is to give you a bit of an understanding of knowing your risk, planning for what you're going to do if you are impacted by a bushfire, or have a fire on your site or bushfire smoke. Plan what you're going to do, get your business ready, be aware and know where to look for information, and look out for each other. So I'm going to take you through a bit of a scenario and just to give you a bit of an idea of what might happen in a bushfire. I'll just tell you a little bit. Oh, sorry, seasonal outlook, forgot a page. So the 2023-24 fire season, the agencies across the country have got together and had a look at the residual fuel loading, and they've determined that the areas in red in New South Wales have an increased risk of bushfire this spring. We've got some higher fuel loads due to the drier than normal conditions that we've had through the winter, an increase Grass growth from all the recent rains that we've had has increased our risk, and that increases the chance of fires establishing, becoming difficult to suppress, and they do have the potential to become more dangerous. So when I go through the scenario, I want you to think about, is it covered in your emergency plan, or what portion of it is covered in your emergency plan? What would your staff do? And what should you do? And where would you go to get more information? So it's Tuesday, it's about 11 o'clock, and we've had temperatures soaring over the past week. A rise in winds and a significant drop in the humidity level. So it's a really dry, hot day. Most of the parks, national parks, have been closed to bushwalkers and campers. Media outlets are reporting that the New South Wales Rural Fire Service and other fire agencies have responded to and contained several bushfires in remote areas. The Bureau of Meteorology is advising that the combination of dry fuels, continuing hot conditions and no rain has drastically increased the fire danger ratings across the state. The fire danger rating today is extreme and it's a total fire ban. An emergency warning's been issued for your location. There we go. So this is what an emergency warning would look like. A social media post and a text message has been received on your phone. And the text message tells you that there's a bushfire or a grass fire, and it's given you instructions that if you're in this area, you need to seek shelter as the fire approaches. It's too late to leave. You go outside and this is what you see. Smoky, the sky's orange, it's almost dark. What's your plan? Most businesses have an emergency plan for fire, and that includes evacuating the building. But is that the right thing to do in these circumstances? An emergency, when you, these procedures that make you evacuate the building doesn't really address the safety of your occupants and getting them outside and relocating them in the open is exposing them to the heat and to the smoke that's created from a bushfire. So what's your plan? So just out of curiosity, if you do have a plan, an emergency plan that would address this situation, can you just type yes in the chat? And that will give me an idea as to how many actually would have this addressed in their emergency plan. None at the moment? Huh? Oh, one. There we go. I'm glad. You've got to know your risk. And not everyone is going to be at risk of bushfire, but you could be at risk of the smoke. And that was demonstrated in 2019-20 bushfires when, you know, the Greater Sydney area was blanketed in smoke. Newcastle was blanketed in smoke for days. So that bushfire smoke is a great risk and should be included into your plan. The Australian bush and the environment, look, is one of the most bushfire-prone areas in the world. And as our population increases, development encroaches, further into bushland areas, and this increases the number of people and property potentially affected by bushfire. Bushfire attack usually takes about 5 forms. So it's wind, smoke, embers, radiant heat and flame. Strong winds resulting from bushfires will drive embers into vulnerable areas of buildings, preheat the dry fuel ahead of a fire, lift roofing and extend flames along a more horizontal plane closer to building elements. While smoke can cause minimal damage to a property, it can severely affect the health of residents. Smoke is a significant factor in a risk developments, particularly where the residents are susceptible to respiratory disorders. Smoke can also reduce visibility during evacuations or sheltering situations. Ember attack is responsible for most bushfire-related building fires. Embers can also cause spotting in advance of bushfire, igniting building elements. And embers are things like leaves, sticks and bark that get sucked up into the convection of a smoke column from a fire, and they can travel up to 30 kilometres ahead of a fire front. And they do cause the most damage. Radiant heat can severely impair the health of residents and the integrity of building elements. Radiant heat can prevent emergency services from assisting occupants at at-risk developments. Flame. So the flame attack will severely restrict firefighting operations, and it will result in the ignition of building elements and a threat to the health of residents and the capacity to evacuate the area. Having a plan aims to improve the preparedness of communities, of people, of businesses. The plan should identify the steps to be followed in the event of a bushfire. And there's some key messaging around bushfires which you should have an understanding of and link this to your plan. Fire danger ratings. These ratings are based on the latest science and technology, and they provide a more clear and accurate rating. These went through a change last year, and so you might not be aware of these new ratings. So you can see it's a simplified version. There's only 4 colours and a little white bar at the bottom, and that means no rating. So on a day where it's raining or predicted to rain with low temperature, then there'll be no rating because there's no risk that day of a bushfire. The higher the rating, the more dangerous the conditions will be, and the rating gives you an indication of the consequence of the fire if a fire was to start. So moderate, our key message is about planning and preparing. So at moderate levels, most fires can be controlled. Just be ready to act if there is one. At high, fires can be dangerous. There's a heightened risk. Be alert for fires in your area, and decide what to do if a fire starts. Extreme, so our key message there is take action now. So fires will spread really quickly and be extremely dangerous under these conditions. If a fire takes, you need to take immediate action. And catastrophic, so that's the highest rating. We don't have many catastrophic days. I think in 2019 and 20, I think there might have been a total of 9 or 10 across the whole fire season for a period of over 6 months. So really, we don't get that many. But when we do, that's when we have the highest level of risk. And for your survival, the best thing to do is not to be in a bushfire area. Now, that's not always applicable for everyone. It depends on where you live and where you work. But having a plan and making decisions now about what you're going to do if we do have catastrophic decisions could save your life. Bushfire alerts. So these give you an indication of what the level of threat is from that fire. Don't wait for a warning. Some fires start and spread so quickly that there might not be time for any warning. If you get a bushfire alert, you must take it seriously. Now, these come via apps, Hazards Near Me, I'll show you that shortly, and it will give you, tell you where the fire is, and then the alert level will tell you what to do. So an advice just tells you that a fire has started and there's no immediate danger, and just stay up to date. Watch and act. There's a heightened level of threat and conditions are changing and you need to start taking action now. An emergency warning. This is the highest level and you may be in danger and you need to take action now, and that's what those warnings mean. So knowing where to get information is a really important tool. The bushfire information line there, 1800 679 737. That number, you ring that and they'll be able to give you some information about the fire. The Rural Fire Service website, rfs.nsw.gov.au. Fires Near Me, well, it's actually now called Hazards Near Me. Local radio. So knowing your local radio stations, ABC network will always give up-to-date information on fires in their area, and they're the emergency broadcaster. And obviously our socials, things like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram will also give you up-to-date information. So this is the RFS website and it's the Fires Near Me page. I'll put the link down there for you so you can note it down. This page shows you where all the fires are across the state. Excuse me. You can see all the little yellow triangles there and they're telling you that all those fires are at a device level. So this is where you can see the alert levels, and then you can actually click on them and then it will give you the details of the fire. So that one there that I've opened up, it tells you where it is, what council area it's in, the status of the fire, so it's under control. It's a bushfire and it gives you its size and who's in charge of it. Now, some of them will say that being controlled, so that would mean that there are appliances on site that are actually dealing with the fire, and some of them will say they're out of control. Now, if they're out of control, it might be because appliances haven't arrived there yet and they're still making an assessment on what's actually happening, or the fire is actually out of control. So just have a look at that and it's an important tool. And it's updated. If you use this from the RFS apps website, it's updated every 90 seconds. So you always have the most up-to-date information. You can download the app. It's called Hazards Near Me. You can get it for your Apple or Android tool. It gives you information about the hazards, and at the moment the hazards are bush and grass fires, flooding and tsunami events. And you can actually set it up and have a watch space, so you can put it on where you live or where you work and have a watch area of, say, 25-kilometre radius, so that when there's something that happens in that area, a new warning, a new alert comes up, it will notify you via your smartphone. So I've got some recommendations here for you in regards to emergency planning for bush and grass fires. So make sure you include bush and grass fires in your emergency plan as well as your internal fires, and include something for bushfire smoke in your emergency plan. Link your plan to some triggers, and I'll show you some triggers shortly. Make sure all of your staff know and understand their plan and what their role is in the plan. Make sure your plan is easy to access, so having it printed and easy for everyone to see, and also being able to access it from home. So if it's happening while you're at home and not at work, you can still see what your plan is. Testing your plan is really important. Having a plan is great, but checking to make sure that what you've got there actually makes sense and everyone understands it and it works is really important. And then reviewing your plan. So things like the Hazards Near Me app changed at earlier this year, so your previous plan might have something different. So making sure you review your plan and it's always up to date. And planning for business continuity. So if you have a situation where you're leaving because that's the message that you've received, what is your business continuity? How are you going to continue to service your clients? And knowing that and having that ready to go when any type of emergency situation happens is a really important tool for all types of businesses. Now, what I've done here is I've put together a bit of a risk matrix, and I've put the current warning levels, so the alert levels at the top and the fire danger ratings down the side. And I've done a bit of a risk matrix for you. And what I'm saying to you here is you'll see on the next page what your actions could be if today was a high fire danger day, and it was today. And if you got a watch and act alert, you could go to number 3 and have some predetermined actions that you should make. So for number 1, these are just some suggestions that I've put together, and you could use something very similar for your business, for your emergency plan for bushfires and grass fires, and be able to link this across and make it a pretty easy tool to use. So consider closing the site if it's number 1. Follow any emergency alert that's been received. Brief your staff. Implement your plan and prepare to evacuate or stay in place depending on what that message says. Monitor the website, the apps, social media sites and local radio. Monitor visitors' movements and be prepared to act for them. If you have any fire protection methods, if you're out, in the bush and rural areas, you might need to deploy them. You might need to advise management or the organising body that you're taking some actions. And you might need to communicate the actions to your community or to your clients so they know what to do. And then obviously as the scores go down, there are less actions to take. You could also put in there about deploying your business continuity plan and other special requirements that maybe your organisation might need, or about relocating and how you're going to do that and who you need to tell, how you're going to get there, and those sorts of things. What are you going to do about special medications that might need to be locked, or things that you might need to take with you so that your business can continue to run. And these are for your lesser matrix scores. So just Again, I think briefing your staff is probably the most important thing when you're going to take some sort of action, so that they all understand what their role is and what needs to be done. So bushfire smoke, we've talked about how that can impact a lot of people over very large distances. And here is just some key points on some things to include in your plan for bushfire smoke. So keeping doors and windows closed is to prevent the smoke entering the building. Ensuring pets have a protected area. If you're in a vehicle and it's really smoky, slow down, keep your windows up and turn your headlights on, and put your air conditioning on so it's recycling inside the car, not coming from outside. If you have asthma or a lung condition, staying indoors would be a better option for you, particularly if the smoke levels are quite high. And if you suffer shortness of breath or coughing develops, take a reliever and or seek medical advice. And there's some really good information about smoke and how to act when there is a lot of smoke from bushfires and from hazard reduction burning on the New South Wales HEBS website and from Asthma Australia. Emergency plans for fires. So it's actually a legal requirement in Australia to actually have an emergency plan, and there's more information. I've got some links in there for you from Safe Work New South Wales and Safe Work Australia about what should be included in your plan. And one of the risks that every building and every organisation faces is actual fire. So having a good fire plan and a good evacuation plan is really important. Now, you can get organisations to actually do this for you. If you did a Google search on emergency management planning or emergency management preparation, you should get a list of organisations that can assist in the development of these plans if you don't have them. They should have an evacuation procedure included. Sorry, I've got a mosquito buzzing me. And clear evacuation diagrams for everybody to follow. Some safety considerations. So what you should do if there is a fire, we use the RACE acronym. So it's remove any persons from immediate danger, alert nearby staff and other occupants and call 000, confine the fire or the smoke. So if it's in a room, by closing the door, if it's safe to do so, and extinguish and control the fire if safe to do so. There's a guide there for fire extinguishers on this particular draft plan that I found, which gives you an idea of what type of extinguishers to have on site. But again, emergency management specialists will be able to guide you in that direction. So finding out if you're in a bushfire prone area is pretty easy. You can go to the Rural Fire Service website, do a search for bushfire prone land. It'll take you to a map where you enter in your address, and then it will tell you whether you're on bushfire prone land or not. There's a really excellent emergency plan development tool for organisations such as childcare centres, aged care facilities, group homes and things like that, all about developing a bushfire emergency plan for those type of organisations that have vulnerable people on site. Information about fire danger ratings and alert levels, and also a link there to the RFS website and the fires near me. And there's some really good emergency planning resources from Safe Work New South Wales, Safe Work Australia, and they have some really good fact sheets and templates for you to use if you don't have an emergency plan. It will give you a place to start. And there's some good business continuity tools from the Small Business Commissioner that I would recommend that you have a look at. So thank you very much. That's the end that I have for you tonight. I'll now hand you back over and have questions after the next presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for pulling all of this together and the risk matrix and the action items. That was extremely helpful to guide in the case of an evacuation. We will take questions for Leanne after the presentations. We have half an hour allocated for a Q&A. I will now hand over to Dr. John Goswell, who will talk about thunderstorm asthma. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. Hoping that you can see my screen.
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Yes, thank you. So yes, I wish to talk about thunderstorm asthma, which is a very important but not commonly discussed disaster scenario. Defined as multiple presentations of acute asthma or bronchospasms immediately after a thunderstorm. The mechanism of thunderstorm asthma is not well understood, but it's commonly thought that with an approaching thunderstorm, the winds pick up the pollens, typically over the rural areas where there's a lot of ryegrass, and the pollens are pulled up into the thunderstorm. The pollens themselves, which are relatively large particles, then are affected by the thunderstorm either by osmotic rupture or by electrostatic events within the thunderstorm, shattering the pollen and releasing the little starch granules within the pollen. What this does is it takes a pollen particle, which is typically around about 30 microns in diameter, and too large to come down into small airways, but it ruptures into these tiny, sometimes submicron particles, so maybe 0.3 of a micron up to perhaps 3 micron in size, releasing for each pollen sac, releasing up to 700 subparticles of starch. And being incredibly tiny, these starch particles can go down into the lower and tiny airways in the lungs. The storm front, as it picks these particles up, it then cools the air and drops the subparticles down in front of the rain front, resulting in what can be a massive increase of pollen particles. You can see here in this photomicrograph with the red arrow pointing to a pollen particle which is rupturing, and the green arrow showing you a tiny subparticle. You can see the massive difference between the two. Interestingly, for the studied thunderstorm asthma events in Australia, it has been ryegrass that has been the allergen. The quintessential thunderstorm asthma event occurred in November in 2016 in Melbourne. Certainly the worst ever recorded event in Australia, but still remains the worst ever event recorded, or at least published or studied in the world. This was a combination of a number of factors which precipitated massive numbers of people to develop bronchospasm. So firstly, there was a very high pollen count, and then the temperature change as the storm approached. So the day had been unusually warm, 35 degrees for a spring day, and then suddenly falling down to 20 degrees as the cold air descending from the storm clouds. Then there were the severe gusty winds, and within an hour, the emergency services started getting calls with regards to respiratory distress. And you can see from the graph the sudden increase in number of calls for that day. By midnight, they had received 1,326 calls, and which is problematic because it overwhelmed the ambulance service. And of the 814 that they decided to send ambulances out to, 643 were their code 1, which meant imminent risk of respiratory arrest. In the first 30 hours, there were well over 3,000 excess respiratory-related presentations to the emergency departments, and 476 excess asthma-related admissions. So you can see from the graph, the sudden spike in the asthma admissions. What was very interesting was that 60% of these people had no prior history of asthma at all. And there was a 3,000 increase in the number of asthma admissions to the intensive care unit. So in total, over the next few days, more than or about 10,000 people were treated for asthma in the emergency departments. And sadly, 10 people died. Now, of those 10, all of them had a previous diagnosis of asthma. And some died within 15 minutes of the onset of symptoms, which is just incredible. Only 3 had asthma management plans, which is something for us to remember. Predominance of men. And one of the big issues was that 3 of these people had waited more than 30 minutes for an ambulance. Unfortunately, they had been told the ambulance was on its way, and consequently they waited. And this was a big wake-up call for the ambulance service, which has since changed its approach to this type of disaster. But the usual message at that time was that an ambulance is on its way. But if these people had known that an ambulance wouldn't get to them, of course, they may have been able to get to the emergency department by other means. So, not only was it the emergency departments, but also primary health care saw an increase in workload. And it's worthwhile to realise that GPs made a substantial contribution to managing the people. But the GPs were still limited because there was only so much medication that, that the GPs kept in their own practice, and limited equipment, and limited space, and limited staff to look after people. And at the time, they weren't getting any information in terms of what was happening. So the pharmacies also played an important role. They had a lot of people present to them, so they were able to give advice in terms of what to do. They were able to supply medication. And in fact, when the hospitals ran out of salbutamol, they were able to provide salbutamol to the hospitals. You can see here one of the after-hours pharmacies in the Melbourne area. You can see the increase in workload. So, but Melbourne is not the only place where thunderstorm asthma has been recorded. An example here is Tamworth in 1990. Following a brief thunderstorm, 110 people presented to the emergency department, and 38 required admission. And at least another 123 were treated by GPs outside of the hospitals. Now these numbers seem to pale compared to the numbers in Melbourne, but the population of Tamworth and Quirindi was a total of 68,000 people compared to 5 million in Melbourne. And if you scale them up, it is in fact the same proportion. Another event was in Wagga in 1997. 215 presentations to ED for asthma, 41 requiring admission, 2 went to ICU. Interestingly, there was a professor who was studying asthma who was there at the time. And so there were good records that were gleaned. And the graph that you'll see here, if I can just point, the black dots show the intact pollen count, and the cleared circles represent the ruptured pollen counts, or the empty shells. You see there was a sudden increase as the storm approached, and not long after, and this is the vertical line, when the presentations for asthma started. This graph here shows the wind speed, and you can see there was this sudden gust. And you can see here the wind direction. There was a sudden change in wind direction. And then the bottom here shows the rain. And when the rain came, it washed out the pollens, and the pollen count dropped right down again. So a very, very short exposure to very high levels of pollen, in particular ruptured pollen, causing a big event within the hospital system. Okay. And the Professor Marks went on to study the risk factors for this to happen. And the interesting thing was that with the study, he compared people who presented with asthma on non-thunderstorm days versus the thunderstorm days, and found that the highest risk factor was people that had recent hay fever. Actually, having asthma wasn't a major risk factor. And this becomes very important. This also was seen in the Melbourne disaster, where 60% of people presenting had not had a previous diagnosis of asthma, but about 99% of people had a previous diagnosis or previous history of seasonal allergic rhinitis. And these people, when they did the allergy testing, the RAS tests, they found that 99% of them were allergic to ryegrass. And it also begs the question of how frequent does thunderstorm asthma occur? And I think a lot of it goes under the radar. Professor Marks decided to have a look at the incidence of asthma spikes in country New South Wales, and he examined the records for 6 country hospitals over a 4-year period, and he found 48 events where the numbers of asthma were 4 standard deviations outside of the mean, and he tracked 48 events, and 52%, in other words, about 24 of those events were related to thunderstorm outflows. So the outflows basically are where there is a downdraft of cold wind coming down from the cumulonimbus clouds and depositing pollens or ruptured pollens. So, and the next worry, of course, is with climate change, we're now getting unseasonable rains, which can stimulate greater production of ryegrass and hence more ryegrass pollens and increased storms. And so we now have the likelihood that we're going to get more thunderstorm asthma events, and that these are going to become more disastrous and more unpredictable. Okay. So therefore we need to look at planning, and I'll look at 3 areas. So the disaster management and the hierarchy, and what planning can be done for general practices and community pharmacies. Okay. Now, this is a busy slide. This is taken from the New South Wales Health Services Area Support Plan, and this is how the disaster management is planned. But as I said, this is too busy. So if I break that slide down into the parts that actually are relevant to the discussion tonight. And if we start off with the 2 areas where this plan may be activated. So the first one would be with the local ambulance services. So if there is a sudden surge in requests for ambulances, then that can be dealt with to a certain degree on a local level, but once it gets beyond that, the ambulance services then escalate that up to the state level. So the state ambulance services, where they can look at employing other resources. Within the hospital system, each major hospital has a medical controller, so a person designated for managing resources, and that person will then look at what they can do. But if the disaster becomes outside of available resources, then they will escalate that to the local health district medical controller, who will look at what he or she can do at that level, and if that's not achievable, then he or she will escalate to the HASFAC. So this is the local health district health services functional area coordinator. Much easier to say HASFAC. And so HASFAC will then look at bringing in extra resources, and should that not be sufficient, then the LHD HASFAC will then escalate that to the state HASFAC. So if you look at what can be done with the ambulance services, the options available to manage a surge, they can look at cancelling scheduled staff breaks, call in more staff, cancel non-urgent calls so that they can concentrate on urgent calls. They can bring in, they can increase the call-taking staff so that they can deal with telephone calls, and then failing that, escalate to the state services, state level. The hospital medical controller can divert staff from the wards to the emergency department or call in more staff, arrange for increased supplies. But as you can see, that's relatively limited. So the hospital medical controller may then have to escalate to the local health district medical controller, who has the ability to move staff from one hospital to another to control where patients are managed, or to escalate that to the LHD HASFAC. And the LHD HASFAC can then has the ability to call in staff from other hospitals and coordinate with other services or suppliers, reallocate services, and escalate up to the state level. Or, which is a relatively new thing, may call on the PHN. Okay. State HASFAC has the ability to bring in people from outside of the region and source supplies from outside the region. But if we look at our wonderful acronym, which is the HNECC-PHN-EOC, so this is our local PHN Emergency Operations Centre. Should a disaster be recognised within our district, then the EOC may be stood up of its own right without necessarily being called upon from other services, but can be stood up should the HASFAC require help from the EOC. It then has some of its own resources and can coordinate care and may be able to source or distribute consumables, and can call upon primary health carers to help out. In my opinion, has the most reliable contact database for primary care for the facilities and for the personnel. So then, what can GPs do if thunderstorm asthma occurs? So, in one sense, you would expect to see a sudden increase in the acute presentations of asthma. In Melbourne, that wasn't always the case. Most of the presentations occurred after the general practices had closed. The after-hours general practice service did see an increase, but not to any great extent, simply because they were a limited resource, and so they just went up to their full capacity, and then anyone else was just referred on to the emergency departments. The other thing is, if we see, if there are 1,000 cases that need to be seen, let's say in the Lower Hunter, and you space that over 300 practices and the emergency departments, then it may be less visible in terms of what's happening, which is why having an organisation like the PHN to coordinate help becomes very important, because the HASFAC can notify the PHN that there is a disaster occurring, and then we can look at what resources can be made available. So GPs can play a very important part in keeping as many people out of hospital as they can, assuming that they can do that safely, because this will make a big difference. Again, if we have, if it happened during the daytime and we've got 500 doctors, and each GP sees 3 patients, so then that's 1,500 people that don't turn up to the emergency department. Important to realise that you might be called upon by the PHN should a disaster occur. Now, this is all voluntary, of course. We're not under obligation, except for the fact that we know that it's the right thing to assist in a disaster. Some practices may be able to help just simply by extending their hours, working later into the night and taking on extra patients. And certainly any practice that is able to take extra patients in a disaster, it's certainly worthwhile cancelling some routine non-urgent patients in order to be able to take on some emergency patients. And the communication can go 2 ways. So if you suspect that there's something going on, then contacting the PHN is a very reasonable thing to find out what's happening. Very, very important to have up-to-date asthma management plans for all our asthmatic patients. So remember that in Melbourne, all the people that died were asthmatic, and only 3 out of those 10 had asthma management plans. In the Tamworth Thunderstorm Asthma event, the director of the emergency department praised the GPs for their management of people with asthma and the fact that they had asthma management plans, because I'm sure that saved a lot of people. And the other thing for us to consider is that that all patients with seasonal allergic rhinitis, where they are allergic to ryegrass, are actually at risk. I know in my own practice, I think I'll start identifying those people with seasonal allergic rhinitis as opposed to perennial rhinitis, and look at doing a rash test and see if they're allergic to ryegrass. It's worth them knowing that should there be a thunderstorm asthma event, that they are at high risk. So within our practices, we should consider thunderstorm asthma in our disaster planning. It may not have happened in our own practice, but if it does happen, then it can be catastrophic. So it's important to have a plan. And in doing so, it's worthwhile deciding what resources we have available and how much space we have for treating people, whether we have enough staff to manage extra people with acute respiratory distress, how much salbutamol we have on deck, and whether we have enough delivery systems, whether we have enough emergency drugs. So it's worthwhile just considering what capacity we have for this sort of event. Worthwhile thinking about the emergency drugs, and we tend to forget about oxygen, but oxygen can be life-saving in this situation. And do we have salbutamol puffers? Do we have salbutamol nebules? Are they all in date? And ipratropium, again, puffers and nebules. Do we have prednisone tablets available? We should have IV hydrocortisone in our black bag kits. Interestingly, in the protocols that have magnesium, I'm not sure how many practices would have magnesium available or whether they should, but it's something to consider if you look at the protocols. And of course, we all should have adrenaline, and just hope that we never have to use it in this situation. Emergency equipment, spacers, nebulizers, oximeters, intravenous access. Not to forget the emergency spacer, that we can, if we have a number of people turn up and we don't have enough spacers, then an old drink bottle can be put to good use. Now, pharmacies can play an important role as well. So should there be a thunderstorm asthma event, they may see an increased number of people presenting with shortness of breath, or wheeze, or cough, and particularly wanting puffers. And pharmacy is an important area of triage. Pharmacists can get an idea of whether the person has mild symptoms, moderate symptoms, or severe symptoms, and point them in the right direction if they need to get help. Pharmacy should bear in mind that it's possible in this sort of disaster scenario they may be asked to provide supplies for hospitals, and certainly for patients and maybe general practices. And pharmacists should have an action disaster management plan for this sort of event, and should realise that they may be contacted by the PHN in terms of supplies, or perhaps even extending hours to provide some services. Prevention, of course, is always best, and this is very hard. There have been various models that have been created to try to predict thunderstorm asthma, but these haven't been well tested at this point. Certainly in Melbourne, they have a very active forecasting system which monitors all of the risk factors and gives public alerts when all the ducks end up in a row. But within our own practices, we should make sure that asthma is treated effectively. And so if we have someone with seasonal asthma, and certainly eosinophilic asthma, we should be thinking whether they need to be on inhaled corticosteroids through the October to December or January risk season. And definitely should have asthma management plans for all of our patients with asthma. There's a consideration of immunotherapy for some of these people. If they have a clear allergy to ryegrass, it may be possible to desensitise them. It's worthwhile that advising people that if there is if they have seasonal allergic rhinitis or seasonal allergic asthma, that when the pollen counts are very high, then staying indoors is the safest thing. Interestingly, I found no discussion about masks, and with the availability of quality masks nowadays, if someone wears a tight-fitting, good quality P95 mask, one would expect that they would be of use, but there's no evidence available for that. Treatment, I'm certainly not going to go into treatment other than providing links to the recommended treatment through the National Asthma Council. So at the end of this presentation, you'll find the links you need to download these charts. And that's everything. I do wish to give thanks to Ian McCarthy, who's our LHD disaster coordinator, and Liz Grist, who's our HASFAC, and David Durham, who's our medical controller, who've been helpful in giving me information for this talk. I've added some resources and then references. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. That was very informative, especially getting a whole introduction how thunderstorm asthma happens, why it happens, and the risk groups to know that, and that might change some of our approaches and how to include certain patients into more detailed talks about thunderstorm asthma risk, and also maybe have an asthma management plan for more patients. As you said, most patients who were negatively affected in Victoria and unfortunately passed away didn't have an asthma management plan, so that just shows us how important it is to be prepared. Leaving it on that note, it's really important to be prepared. So you did very well. Thank you for joining our trilogy event. We hope we could give you some overview of the 6 topics, the hot topics in disaster management for the preparedness in our region. Of course, there are many, many more topics. We could talk about this for days. It's just important to have a plan in place to communicate this with your staff, to practice the plan. If you have questions, reach out to us, to the PHN. We're here to help you. If you have feedback for us, for example, you want to see something included or more detailed education events on the topic, please reach out. We will stay active in the disaster preparedness and disaster management space, especially now that we have the fire season ahead of us with a lot of fire predicted heat wave. Drought is already declared in some areas, so we will stay active and stay tuned. You can see all the new communication pieces on our PHN News homepage. And soon we will also have a dedicated disaster management landing page on our homepage. I would now pass on to Phoebe, who will read out questions from the chat, if we have some for tonight.
Thank you. We don't have many. So I do want to encourage those attending, please quickly type through some questions for us, because this is a great opportunity to have them answered. I do have two. Both are for Leanne. Sorry, John. Hopefully some come through for you. So Leanne, I have one just from Vincent stating that the find hazards near me hasn't been working after updating. Have you received that feedback before, or?
It depends. So what actually happens is, depending on the level of fire, is how often they need to be updated. So if it's an advice fire, it's only updated once a day unless something changes. If it's a watch and act fire, it gets updated twice a day at 11 o'clock and 3 o'clock unless the situation changes. And if it's at a fire at an emergency warning level, it's updated every 30 minutes.
Okay.
I hope that clarifies that.
And just a question around fire extinguishers. When choosing the right fire extinguisher for my practice, do I understand correctly that you would recommend practice owners consult with third-party providers to assess the rooms and buildings to choose the right fire extinguisher? I guess the type of extinguisher might vary depending on the type and source of the fire.
Yes, it would depend on what could catch on fire in each room. So one room might store hazardous chemicals that might need to be extinguished in a certain way compared to maybe your waiting room, which would probably need a different, more general type of fire extinguisher. So that's why I would highly recommend that you use a contractor to come in and make those assessments and make those recommendations for you. And your fire extinguishers should be checked every 6 months as well to make sure that they are valid and still hold pressure. And also, I would encourage you to have some training in how to use them. Sometimes it can be a bit scary. You're not too sure what to do. They're very easy to use. And yeah, it's also a little bit of fun.
Thank you. Unfortunately, at the moment, no other questions have come through. So I wanted to give a huge shout out to John and Leanne for your presentations tonight. Well aware that you both have your 9-to-5 jobs and you've gone out of your way to do this presentation for us, and we really do appreciate it. Ellen, the driving force behind hassling everyone to get their presentations in, thank you so much. And to all of our attendees who have taken the time to spend the evening with us, we really do appreciate it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's a really good program.
Thank you to our speakers, and have a good evening, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your night. Hopefully we'll see you soon in the next disaster and emergency management relevant education event. So stay tuned. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.